Welcome back to your show. As we enter the peak of the hurricane season, it's really hard to forget what happened in New Orleans a few years back during Katrina. Well, there's now a new administrator for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and as Craig Fugate told us earlier this week when he answered your questions, he expects you to step up and do your part. Minister, thank you so much for being with us on your show.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
So let me ask you, our first question comes from Chris Seacombe in Summit County. It says, we've seen a significant amount of our forest devastated by the pine beetle, and Colorado's not alone. What is FEMA doing to prepare for the possibility of a catastrophic wildfire in the West, the kind that we haven't seen in our lifetime?
Well, it kind of goes back to what is FEMA's role and responsibility. We're part of a federal team. Really, when you talk about wildland and timber management, those are not things that FEMA does. Those are other programs, oftentimes private landowners, but also our U.S. forests and other state and local landowners that have forests. And again, we tend to deal with the consequences if something happens. The management and how do you mitigate against that really falls in the purview of who's responsible for those timber stands, who owns that, and what's the best way to go forward. And again, when you look at the pine beetle and that threat, there are a variety of threats. We face many of these in other parts of the country, oftentimes with these drought cycles where we see the invasion of the beetles, the impacts on timber. And again, FEMA's role historically has been, if the disaster occurs, we then address that with financial assistance, but particularly in wildland management, those tend to be other partners that have the answers to that, not FEMA.
You mentioned the word threat. Jim Turney writes in, he views it a little differently, says, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing FEMA today?
I think probably my biggest challenge is getting people to understand that they're part of the team. When you talk about disasters, oftentimes what people see in the role that they portray FEMA is that somehow we are the organization that does everything, and we're not. We're just part of the team. Most of your response is going to take place with local and state resources, and then we represent on behalf of the President and the Secretary of Homeland Security the federal resources. You've got the private sector, you've got faith-based, but one part of this team that I think we really have not paid a lot of attention to is the public. Is we look at disasters as if everybody in a disaster area is waiting for somebody to take care of them, and I know that's not the case. So how do we do a better job of recognizing that the public's our best untapped resource when we talk about very large-scale, complex disasters, and how do we recognize that they're part of the team and not the liability? So I say my biggest challenge is getting people to take more responsibility for being prepared and doing a couple of things I think people here do already, and that is know that there's things that can happen, be ready to have a plan, but probably the one thing we really want to drive home is when disaster strikes, if you and your family are okay, check on the neighbors. That will help more people faster than anything I'll ever be able to accomplish in my short 10 years as being administrator. And I know that's things that people here in Colorado do every day. When something happens, they help out and reach out to each other.
It's interesting you mentioned the public. Kerry Smith from Littleton says, many of us saw what happened after Hurricane Katrina, and we'll have trouble, her words, trusting FEMA again. How do you restore the public's faith in an agency that is so important?
I guess the question is, what were you expecting FEMA to do? And it was oftentimes portrayed that of all the system failures that occurred and the failure to get help to people, that you had a singular agency that was determined that it is all FEMA. And I guess, well, you can try to fix FEMA if that's what you think is the outcome you're looking for, but it doesn't get to the bottom line. FEMA is part of the team. We support and provide assistance, but the majority of the response and capabilities are at the local levels of governments and state levels. Our job is to support that. And again, I think when you come back and you look at Katrina, you got to look at underlying issues. Why did we end up with a response that was so woefully inadequate? And what do you need to do to build that capability? And I think oftentimes the easy answer is we're going to fix FEMA. It doesn't really go back to the crux of the matter. We've got to build a more robust capacity as a nation to work as a team.
You alluded to it a little bit. Tony Lucas in Denver said, speaking of Katrina, what are the lessons to be learned not just by FEMA, but also by local governments in the future?
That disasters aren't always predictable. It's easy to look at hurricanes and see them coming and then gear up for those storms. And even with that information, we weren't as successful as we could have been in Katrina. There was a lot of failure there. But what happens to communities that think, well, we don't really have disasters and something strikes, and they haven't really thought about how they're going to work and what the various pieces are to work as a team? And I think, the lesson of Katrina is we're a modern-day society. People didn't think you could have thousands of deaths from a disaster, particularly a natural hazard producing that disaster. The reality is we are that vulnerable. And people need to understand that that risk is always evolving, it's changing, it's constantly moving target for some communities depending upon rainfall, drought, other events that we don't have control over. And it's understanding that the next disaster is what we have to plan for. And we have to look at really how you build that team. How do you bring the resources to bear fast to change the outcome? And those resources may be coming from the private sector. They may be coming from volunteer groups. They may be your neighbor. And our role at FEMA is really to build that team. And so the lesson of Katrina is we need to make sure people understand we all have roles and responsibilities and not just look to one part of government to take on all of that and try to be that solution, because we know that at a point such as Katrina, it's going to fail if we don't have a team approach to solving problems.
We have one of your predecessors, Michael Brown, who lives in this area, and he's been a guest on the program before, answered a number of questions. He has mentioned on our program about the lack of a national plan, national response plan, if you will. And Ava Greenwell writes in saying, how much of a concern is it to the average American that we don't necessarily have a national response plan in place?
Well, here's my question. What do people want to see in a national response framework or plan, or how do you describe it? To me, it's the architecture. The tendency is you think the plan's got all the answers. The plan doesn't have all the answers. What the plan should do is tell you how you're going to build a team that can solve the problems you know about, the hazards you're familiar with, and the ones you never heard of or didn't know could happen. And I think that's one of the things you run into a trap. We should have a plan for that hazard. Well, the ones we know, we will write plans that will get us there, but more importantly, the planning process in a national plan should identify how do you build a team that can solve the problems we know about and the ones we never heard about, and build a team that takes advantage of and builds upon the resources at the local, state, and federal level without setting up a domino where each level's got to fail before the next level kicks in, but really build a team that the best and most appropriate resources get there fast enough to change the outcome, and recognize that may be your neighbor across the way, it could be a neighboring state, it could be a federal resource, it could be from the Department of Defense, it could be from agriculture, it could come from a variety of places. The public doesn't really, I think, sometimes get too wrapped around who's doing it, so long as they know that that system is built so that resources get in, we're able to change those outcomes, and that we built a team and built a system that can solve problems we know about. But more importantly, do you know when the next disaster is going to strike? Do you know what the next disaster is going to be? More importantly, do we have the team in place to deal with the unknown? And that's, I think, a challenge we have to continue to work and build upon. But part of that is recognizing it's not just government that's part of that team. It is the private sector. It's volunteer, faith-based, community organizations. It's the public.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.